So at our last meeting, we started to get into John Locke's essay concerning human understanding. After we're finished with this, we're going to move on to David Hume. He's a Scottish philosopher. Comes just a short time after John Locke. And his, I guess, what would we call it? I was going to call it an essay, but it's not an essay. It's an inquiry concerning human understanding. They were like super duper creative in the early modern era when they were titling their pieces. But the two are kind of like, it's not just accidental that their titles match up. They're doing very, very similar things. So I mentioned, I think, at our last meeting that while in book one, when Locke is laying out his purpose, he's talking about one of the things that he's trying to figure out is when we don't have absolute certainty, how much confidence is warranted in the sorts of ideas or beliefs that we have. We're not going to really wade into what Locke has to say about that. We're going to pass the baton off to Hume because he's going to say way more bombastic stuff. At our last meeting, we talked about book one, where early on in book one, we get a statement of purpose from John Locke and the sorts of things that he's going to be talking about in this essay. What does he say he's up to? Refresh my memory. What does John Locke purport to be doing in his essay concerning human understanding at the very, very beginning? And near as I can tell, he's not lying. That is what he does. Yeah, Corbin.
Isn't one of the first things he talks about like the three different types of ideas?
Oh, that's like we're way into like book two by the time we're talking about different kinds of ideas.
How's arguments going to go?
What's that? Yeah.
How's arguments going to go?
Yeah, he's kind of outlining the shape of the argument through all four books. I mentioned one of the things that he says he's going to do. This is what comes up in book four, this question of how much certainty is warranted or how much confidence is warranted when I don't have absolute certainty. So this is kind of like clearly an addition to the conversation from what Descartes was doing, right? Descartes was talking about how to find an absolutely certain foundation, and Locke is saying, like, come on, we don't always have that, and that's a crazy high bar for what you're going to believe. So we need to talk about what kind of confidence you have when you're not absolutely certain. What else does he have to say? There's like one thing that folks have already gotten, just two people have talked. You've already gotten very, very close to it. Where do ideas come from? Not necessarily like what kinds of ideas are there. That's going to be part of spelling out where they come from. And part of how he's going to talk about the different kinds of ideas is by talking about ideas that come from different places, right? Or that have sort of different sorts of mechanisms by which they come to our understanding. So yeah, where do ideas come from? Anything else? Universal assent gets into this business about innate ideas. So let's shelf that for just a second. One more thing. It's relatively simple. Margaret Cavendish purported to be up to a similar sort of thing. Yeah, Jula. Yeah, we want an understanding of understanding, right? Well, this is kind of like proto-psychology. He's not doing like straight up empirical psychology. Nobody would read John Locke's essay concerning human understanding and mistake it for contemporary psychological research. There's just not like any drawing on data. He's turning inward, right, mostly to like figure out like how does my mind work, and then assuming that this is more or less how most minds will work. Or he's trying to figure out from logical first principles how ideas would have to be if there are going to be ideas. So it's not straight up empirical psychology just yet, but you can tell he's kind of pushing in that direction. We want an understanding of the understanding. We want, I think I mentioned this phrase, like a user's manual for the mind. And Descartes was up to a similar sort of thing. If you have a proper user's manual for the mind, then you won't use it improperly, and you won't make unnecessary mistakes. And then you won't blame God for like creating you in such a way that you made mistakes when you just didn't use your own mind properly. Okay. That's the statement of purpose. Then he goes into this tirade where he's kind of like setting the stage and he's saying, okay, for a long, long time, for at least 1,000 years, we're almost working up on 2,000 years here, people have been talking about innate ideas, and John Locke says, phooey, no such thing as an innate idea. That is not a phrase that like comes out of my mouth very easily. But an innate idea. Yeah, there are no innate ideas. And this is where we get into these questions of universal assent, because those who are arguing in favor of the existence of innate ideas, most of them, according to Locke at least, seem to be angling at this like there are ideas with universal assent, and it seems like that gives us some sort of evidence to this notion that those ideas that do have universal assent are probably innate. This is the path that the argument that Locke is arguing against seems to take. Why aren't there innate ideas? Because children innate, yeah. So like if the route to innate ideas is through universal assent, Locke says there are no ideas with universal assent. Exhibit A, children. Exhibit B, idiots. They don't assent to even like the most obvious of things, like that which is, and that which is not, and cannot be. These are like very, very sorts of basic things that any rational person would seemingly have to agree with. Triangles have three sides. Not all children will assent to that. They might need to be shown, right? So then there's this whole kind of contortion and kind of like dancing around where Locke is trying to help the innate ideas camp out and saying like, well, maybe you want to do it this way. Sometimes folks will do it this way. And they're all seemingly trying to talk about ideas that you would assent to under the proper conditions. And some of those conditions involve you've been taught what all the words mean, or you've kind of applied reason to the question of like, do I assent to this idea or not? And he points out that like all of these seem to be adventitious, to use the phrase that, or to use the term that Descartes uses for this. These are ideas that you come to, that you create yourself. And if that's the case, then they can't be innate, right? If they're acquired ideas, they can't be innate ideas, because the whole point of an innate idea is that it's not acquired. You always have it. You start with it. That's what makes it innate. Not only that, not only do these all seem to be acquired ideas, but if you try to make it so that we say something like, well, the idea comes to your awareness, or you become explicitly kind of keyed into the idea comes to your attention, or like the idea was always there and now you've remembered it, you've recollected it, to like kind of take the Platonic path. Yeah. Then, yeah, it's no longer an idea, Locke says. If it's an idea that has not come to the understanding, if it's an unconscious idea, and this is what your writing assignment is about, if it's an unconscious idea, Locke says, that just doesn't seem like an idea. What are these ideas that aren't in anybody's mind? Or they're in people's minds, but they've not been thought yet. What the hell is an idea that hasn't been thought? Because it seems like ideas are the things that get thought. And if it ain't thought, then it ain't an idea. Ideas are the things that thinkers think. And if no thinker is thinking an idea, it's not like, ooh, it's like waiting and dormant. Like, this makes no sense, Locke suggests. And you're being asked to kind of weigh in on this. Like, does he have a point? Because it's kind of the last claim that he makes to kind of banish this notion of innate ideas. And if we get rid of that, then that means that we're starting with nothing. It's kind of very similar to the Cartesian project, only instead of taking it on in 6 meditations, Locke is kind of setting up a version of the human mind that starts off more or less like the Cartesian meditator does in Meditation 1. Every single infant is the meditator at the end of Meditation 1. Every single infant starts with nothing, no ideas, no innate ideas, a tabula rasa, a blank slate. And if we start like that, then what we have to do is try to figure out, all right, so I'm not a blank slate now. I have all kinds of ideas. Some of them true, some of them false, some of them embarrassing. I have tons and tons of ideas. So how did they get in my head? How did I come to have those ideas? And that's the whole rest of Book 2 and an awful lot of Book 3. Book 3 is concerned with a little bit of philosophy of language and like how it is that abstract concepts work. We're almost certainly not going to even dip into that. You got a little taste of it in your reading assignment. Book 4 has to do with this question that he mentions in his statement of purpose. It has to do with confidence and certainty and those sorts of things. We're not going to mess with that. Like I said, we're handing the baton off to Hume for that. So where we're going to hang out today is Book 2, where we start talking about ideas, where they come from if we suppose that we start out as a blank slate, and all the different kinds of ideas there are. There's a whole lot of distinction making. There's a whole lot of taxonomy going on here with John Locke in Book 2. Of his essay concerning human understanding. And we're going to try our best to kind of trace through this. He's taking what is clearly, I think I would say is clearly, maybe this needs some explication. Maybe this is a good exam question. It seems like John Locke's an empiricist, as opposed to a rationalist. We've discussed this distinction before. If you're still a little fuzzy on it, catch me in office hours, send me an email, look back through your notes. I won't rehearse it. But it seems like John Locke is an empiricist, perhaps in a similar vein that kind of Princess Elizabeth and Margaret Cavendish were nudging the conversation after Descartes, who seemed to clearly be a rationalist. I'm not sure if I would say that John Locke is a materialist, though, the same way that Princess Elizabeth and Margaret Cavendish seem to be leaning towards materialism. Materialism being this metaphysical theory or this metaphysical position by which we say there's only one kind of substance, and that substance is matter. In fact, there are some clear places where Locke is talking about the soul or the mind or like what it is that like what thinking substance is all about. And he seems to kind of freely admit that like it just doesn't seem to make sense to call this matter. It must be some other thing. So I don't know if John Locke is a materialist, but he's definitely an empiricist. Kinda. Except he's not doing anything empirical in this essay. And he seems to think that he's coming up with some kind of knowledge, so maybe not. Maybe all philosophers have this kind of like, this little rationalist deep in their soul. All right, statement of purpose, no innate ideas, book 1, chapter 1. Ideas come from two possible places. All ideas come from two possible places. David Hume's going to pick this one up too, and he's going to do it in, I think, a slightly more sharpened way. In fact, it's going to be called Hume's fork. Whenever you hear somebody talk about a philosophical fork, it means somebody's trying to force you into one of two options, and neither one of those options is going to be fun for you. Locke starts out a similar way. He says, all ideas come from two sources. What are those two sources? I'll give you a hint. You can find the answer in Book 2, Chapter 1. I think probably in the first paragraph, if not the first few paragraphs. First few paragraphs, if not the first paragraph. Got the text with you? If you stare at your desk long enough, the answer might appear there. Yeah. Ideas don't come from like unconscious, some unconscious land. You just got finished saying like, that's a crazy idea. There are no ideas that are unconscious ideas. It's just antithetical to what an idea is. Experience? Yeah, sure. Two kinds of experience, though. A little more specific. What's that?
Perception.
Close. There's a passive form, yeah. Guys, I noticed like you read well. You remember things. Just not necessarily in the order that the authors are exposing them. The order's important. That's how the argument makes sense. Sensation, that's one of them. Boom. Thank you. Sensation. You guys make outlines when you read? Do you take notes when you read? Do you read? Do you read just enough to do the reading quiz? And then leave the rest? Please don't. Please read for real and like take notes, maybe even outline. That's helpful. A lot of these philosophers, John Locke in particular, pretty well organized. Like, he's done us a favor. He's not just kind of like wandering through this topic. He's got a very kind of strategic approach to it. All ideas come from two sources. One of them is sensation. The other one is reflection. This is an interesting dichotomy. One of the things that we might notice in this sensation-reflection dichotomy is that sensation seems to be a description of, and John Locke doesn't use this term necessarily. I'm trying to get some conceptual furniture in the door for when we finally read Immanuel Kant. But sensation seems to be some sort of outer sense. Sensation is like the experiences that come from without. Sense experience, for example. And some folks mention perception, although that seems to be a broader category than just sensation. There can be perceptions that are reflective perceptions, for example. And reflection, by contrast, if sensation is an outer kind of sense, reflection is a, yeah, good, inner. It's an inner sort of sense. And in fact, we can just think about this. Descartes kind of like, he didn't make this very explicit, but you could see it at work as he was going through the meditations, that there's this occasional turning of your attention, right? Either you can kind of turn your attention to like what's coming in from the outside world, or you can turn your attention towards like what's going on in your mind. And that little flip seems to be this thing that, like, a lot of philosophers, particularly early modern philosophers of mind, like John Locke, get really interested in, this ability to kind of like, boop, 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 boop. Ideas come, ideas are coming from outside, from sensation. Oh, ideas are also coming from inside, like my mind is working and I'm getting ideas from how my mind is working. So sensation and reflection. Yeah, Jacob.
So why is reflection on ideas to create or to come up with new ideas? Why is that not rational?
Using reflection to come up with new ideas?
Yeah.
Because it can't do it if there hasn't been some sensation at first. If you start out as a blank slate, as a tabula rasa, or as many tabulae rasa, if you start out as a blank slate and you turn your reflective gaze inward, what will you find? Nothing. There will be nothing there. If you have some ideas that have come in from outside, from sensation, and now you turn your eye inward and start reflecting, now there's something to reflect on. So this is one reason why we would call him not a rationalist and empiricist, because he seems fairly insistent that that has to happen first, otherwise this never gets off the ground. Whereas Descartes and other rationalists seem content to suggest that maybe you can do this without any of this, that you can suspend any beliefs that you have about sensation or outer sense and do pure reflection. We'll also see when Locke starts talking about how complex ideas are formed, including some of the better candidates for the sorts of things that Descartes would suggest are innate ideas, or are kind of the things that can be developed through rational reflection alone, supposedly, or this is what a rationalist would say. We get some sense of how it is that Locke seems to be suggesting that those abstract ideas are abstracted from experience, instead of those ideas are there in order to help us make sense of experience as we're having it. I'll get into that a little more as we get further down. But yeah, that's an excellent question. And I get nervous about this kind of John Locke is an empiricist because he's a philosopher. He's doing metaphysics here. There's plenty of stuff that he's doing. David Hume's going to look at the stuff that John Locke is doing and be like, you're not an empiricist, buddy. Look at all this work that you're doing that's not particularly empirical. But the way that he's describing the way that the human mind works, perhaps if we kind of suspend what he himself is doing in this essay, seems to be a description of a human mind that works according to an empiricist epistemology. Any other questions? Questions? All right. All ideas come from two sources, sensation and reflection. And in addition to all ideas coming from two possible sources, there are two major kinds of ideas. Now we can say, well, there are the ideas that come from sensation, there are ideas that come from reflection. And Locke says, yeah, there are those two, there's that division when we're talking about ideas, their provenance, where they came from. But in addition to that, we have this distinction between simple ideas and complex ideas. And Book 2 is mostly dealing with how it is that we're going to cash out a discussion of simple ideas, how it is that we're going to cash out a discussion of complex ideas, and what we think that the mind and the understanding is doing when those ideas are generated. Not just the understanding, but also the will. We'll find out that's a thing. So simple ideas. Simple ideas. There are four kinds of simple ideas. This is how Locke works, right? There are two kinds of these things. Of these things, there are three kinds of these things. Of these things, there are four kinds of these things. He's just making distinctions. He's a good metaphysician. Just distinctions, categories. This will kind of clean up the way that we think about this business. Simple ideas. There are four kinds. There are simple ideas from one sense alone. There are simple ideas from not one sense alone, but from multiple senses. There you go. We got two more.
Wouldn't they all be grouped into senses?
Of those simple ideas that come from the senses alone, some of them come from one sense alone, and some of them come from multiple senses.
Why not just group that as senses? Is my question.
You could. He's making finer distinctions, which presumably makes him a more careful thinker, I think. I had a professor who told me this when I was an undergraduate, that being intelligent and educated hinges on the ability to make fine distinctions. If you're kind of painting a whole big group of things with one broad brush and refusing to acknowledge differences within that group. Maybe you're kind of glossing over important stuff. So from one sense alone, from multiple senses, and as we go through these, Jacob, maybe you'll get a sense of like, oh yeah, that was a valuable distinction to make. Third category, I'll give you a hint, it ain't about the senses at all. Ooh, that sounds like a great multiple choice distractor answer. Nope, not God. All ideas come from two sources. What are they? Sensation and reflection. There are simple ideas that come from one sense alone. There are simple ideas that come from multiple senses. Those are the ideas that come from sensation. All ideas come from two sources, sensation and... Our third category are simple ideas that come from... Yeah, there you go. See, it makes sense. There's a logic to it. And these are from, I'll give you another hint, these are from reflection alone. And then we have a fourth category, which are simple ideas that come from not multiple reflections, but they come from reflection and sensation. Yeah. I'll even give an and/or sensation. So, okay, maybe some examples will help sort of flesh out what it is we're talking about. Yeah, Corbin.
So if John Locke makes a distinction between one sense and multiple sense ideas, shouldn't he also make a distinction between reflection and one sense and reflection and multiple senses?
We will kind of sort of do that. One of the things that might kind of pop up is, do you have multiple senses? Approximately how many? About 5, like maybe 6. Depending on which ones you count and how you count them, or if you're a particularly gifted person who has like powers that I am skeptical of, maybe you have more than 5. So there are definitely multiple senses. How many different kinds of reflection do you have? It's not clear how many different kinds of reflection there are. Maybe we'll get clear on it later. If there are multiple kinds, then maybe we would say, like, John Locke, you should have come back and made an additional distinction here. But I think because reflection seems to be like, when you turn your mind's eye inward, can you also turn your mind's ear inward, and your mind's tongue, and your mind's nose inward? Or is it all just like, it's all just reflection? It's all just like, what's going on in my head right now? It's that one? In which case, yeah, we don't actually have, maybe we don't have multiple reflections. Great question. All right, from one sense alone. Examples? Simple ideas that you get from just one sense alone. And by the way, these simple ideas, this is what gets things moving. You start out as a blank slate, and then ideas come in from outside, through sensation. The first ones that come in are really simple. They've got to be. If they're complex, then you made them out of multiple simple ideas, and that's over. That's shit that like you don't get from outside. That's stuff that like your mind starts making those complex ideas. So I heard somebody say color. Yeah, color is from one sense alone. Anything else from one sense alone? Hardness. He also talks about solidity in a conversation that maybe is about hardness. That's an interesting one. We'll come to. I want to mention that just because it's a peculiar one of all the ones that he mentions, and we should probably address what it is that he's talking about there. He devotes like a whole section of this chapter on like solidity. Color. Anything else? Color is from one sense. Which sense? That one. What are your other senses? Come on. Yeah. Smell. So an odor, right? Or a scent. A tone. Loudness? Not so much. We'll get to loudness in a second. That might be a type of complex idea. Yeah, Adam. Vibration from one sense alone? What sense?
No.
Okay.
I guess that would be feeling and hearing.
And hearing is also a vibration. And maybe hearing is a sophisticated kind of feeling. Yeah, maybe. Sight, smell, touch. Oh, he talks about warmth and coldness. Warm and cold. I only get that through touch, right? Can you see how warm something is? Can you see warmth with your eye? You can get all kinds of cues that something would feel warm if you touched it. It's glowing, and there's like, there's all those kind of like wavy lines all around it. So it's probably hot if I feel it. But there's no hotness to my visual perception, right? Flavors. He mentions solidity as one of these, which is an interesting one. And what he means by solidity, by the way, is not like how dense something is. It's that it's impenetrable. It's that like two material things can't take up the same space at the same time. So there's like this thing and then there's this thing. And how do I know that this thing is solid? Well, because I can't put my hand through it. And every time I try to, I feel resistance. This is why he suggests that it's a simple idea from one sense alone. Solidity is something that you get from touch. You can't tell that something is impenetrable just by looking. You might be able to tell that if something is hollow or dense by kind of like listening to the sounds that it makes, but you can't tell that it's impenetrable through hearing. So all of these are simple ideas that come from one sense alone. Compare that to simple ideas that come from multiple senses. This is if this ain't interesting, then sorry. For multiple senses, he includes examples like, this is going to keep going for the whole session. So taste you only get through one sense, though, right? Your sense of taste?
I think if you couldn't smell, you couldn't taste.
If you couldn't smell, you couldn't taste? Well, there are basic taste flavors, and then the rest of it is odor. And sometimes we mush them together. We say, that tastes like lasagna, and we'd be like, no, there's sweet, salty, bitter, and umami. And then everything else that makes it lasagna is odor.
Okay.
Yeah. You guys are, all right, doing good so far? From multiple senses, how about shape? And it requires multiple senses to get the simple idea. Because if it required multiple senses to make the simple idea, it wouldn't be simple, right? It would be complex. So it's a simple idea, and it's because I can get that simple idea from one sense or another sense. So shape, can you see shapes? Can you feel shapes? Can you hear shapes? Or if you're really good at hearing. Like if you're a bat. Or a dolphin. Or a blind person. There are plenty of instances of blind people that are able to navigate obstacles in a room just by making clicking sounds and hearing them kind of bounce back. You might not be able to get a really clear idea of what the shape of something is through hearing, and we probably couldn't do it very well at all, not without a whole lot of practice, but it seems like you can get shape from hearing. Space. Space? Space. Did he actually say space? Are you getting that from the text? Okay, good. I'm going to come back.
Space or extension?
Extension. Yeah, thanks. Or size, maybe. Duration. Something like rest, motion. Yeah. Is it clear how I get these from multiple senses? Yes? Great. Let's move on. From reflection alone, he mentions this and then declines to actually give any examples. Thanks, John Locke. He'll give some examples later. We'll get some idea of the things, simple ideas I can get from reflection alone. But he skips over it at first. And then from both reflection and or sensation, there are a couple of really good examples that he tosses out. We get from, power. I'm going to circle some of these in a different color because we're going to come back to them. In that same conversation, I think he says unity.
Pain or uneasiness.
There we go. Pain. And what comes along with pain? Pleasure. Let's start with pain and pleasure there. Is it clear that pain and pleasure can come from the senses? That's the easy part. Is it clear that pain and pleasure can come from reflection? If you reflect on an idea, can it bring you pleasure or can it bring you pain? Yeah. Like a busted relationship. Like, reflect on that. Oh. Justice. Reflect on that. Oh. All right. I don't get that from the senses, right? That's something that I attend to through reflection. Power, which is, we'll get into a whole conversation about power, and it's going to be confusing. I circled it because it pops up in a discussion of complex ideas, but it was also over there in the simple ideas. What are you doing, John Locke? But power, can you get a sense of power through sensation? You can get an idea of power through sensation. Also, through reflection, you recognize that you're in control of your thoughts, that you can change your thoughts. There's a power as well. You get through sensation and reflection. Okay, let's pick these up.
Different sort of power between the two, a different sort of pain and pleasure, though?
Sure, perhaps, but they're both power, right? Like there are different kinds of birds, but they're all birds, right?
But isn't that just dependent on the label? Like, the thing itself is different. He talks about how words are arbitrary.
Yeah.
How
Well, okay,
it's
sure, yeah.
arbitrary in the sense that we assign a label to some.
Yeah, so I call both mental pain and physical, like sensory pain, both pain. But maybe they're two completely different kinds of things. They just happen to have the same word.
Because they're both unpleasant.
I would expect that to be like not consistent from one language to the next if it was really arbitrary and about language. I don't speak that many languages. Is that how this works? Anybody speak another language besides English pretty fluently? How do you say a physical pain? Schwer. How do you say a mental pain? Oh, different words. Oh, okay. Maybe this is a function of the English language. Good catch. You guys are sharp. You don't necessarily remember the ideas in the right order, but yeah, good. Good questions. All right. From reflection alone, he mentioned, so yeah, he might be stumbling here. Pleasure and pain, I think, are like two great examples of the sort of thing, like, and we might think of pleasure and pain as being kind of reward and punishment emotions that we have, or experiences that tell us to like go towards it, like keep doing that, that's good, or like stop doing that, that's bad. And maybe it functions both mentally and physically the same way. We do tend to want to make a distinction between these two sorts of things, though, right? Although frequently we also collapse the two. If I'm talking about like what you're legally responsible for in a kind of a civil suit, it doesn't have to be physical pain and suffering. It could be mental pain and suffering as well. All right. From reflection alone, John Locke gets us into an interesting sort of conversation where he says, all right, so what are the ideas when I just turn my mind inward and I start attending to my own thought process? What are the simple ideas that present themselves? And he starts talking about that there are at least these two, he only discusses these two, faculties of the mind. One of them he refers to as perception. And in fact, he tosses a whole bunch of other words. This is maybe one of the more charming things about John Locke. He's not super precious about his terminology. You can tell sometimes he's kind of triangulating a concept by throwing as many words as he can at it and be like, it's like this and like this and like that and like this. And like, you get what I'm talking about, right? From like all those words. And like, oftentimes I find myself reading John Locke and be like, yeah, I think I get what you're talking about. So he says there's perception. He also refers to this activity as thinking. And he says the faculty that's responsible for it, this is what he refers to as the understanding. And he's not the first on the scene to use those terms. And he's not using them in a very like super duper rigorous way where they mean something very specific. He's kind of triangulating a rough idea with it. Then there's this other faculty of the mind which he refers to as the activity is volition. And the faculty responsible for it is, he calls it the will. We saw this distinction with Descartes as well, right? That there's like the understanding, which is just the theater of the mind, where like all the ideas get presented to you. And then there's the will, which is somehow a little bit different. One of the big differences that Locke identifies between perception and volition, or between the understanding and the will, is he says the understanding seems to tend to be a sort of a passive mental faculty. The ideas just kind of come to you. And you watch the screen and you see what's happening, but you're not responsible for like the ideas that kind of like pop into your kind of like attention. Seemingly. There's something passive about perception. You sit there and you wait and it happens to you. Maybe you like go seek it out and you're like, well, all right, I had to open my eyes. There's a little bit of activity there. Yeah, but once you open your eyes, like the sights come to you. There's a passivity to perception. Yeah, Shad. He's not talking about emotion in any sort of rigorous way. I don't think anywhere. Not that I can think of in the essay. No, he's talking about sense perception. He's talking about sight, sound, smell, like all of these things. And these things too. All of our simple ideas that come from sensation. These are perceptive. There's also reflective perception. You can like turn your attention inward and see like what's going on in there, but you don't like make the ideas happen. You're just kind of like watching the movie as it kind of unfolds. Again, somewhat passive. Compared to that, the will and volition is incredibly active. So we have this kind of like a passive faculty of the mind and an active faculty of the mind. With perception, he says, this is the one that's kind of like the most easily and readily known. This is like your first simple idea from reflection. Turn inward and see like what's going on in my mind. And like one of the first things that you'll recognize is like, well, I'm perceiving stuff. And you're like, yep, there you go. Like your first reflective simple idea is that you are capable of perception, that perceptions are happening in your mind. And all you need to do to be aware of it is to attend to what's going on in your mind. Locke frequently talks about this, that like your ability to come up with these ideas is in large part a function of like your attention. If you pay close attention to something, you will notice these finer distinctions. You will come up with more ideas. If you never turn your attention inward, then yeah, these are not going to be like big ideas for you. Maybe you won't have them at all, although that's kind of surprising to not have them at all. But maybe you won't think very sophisticatedly about them if you just never turn your attention inward to reflection. This one's the most readily known. It's the easiest one. We might even get shades of Descartes, kind of talking about like when I suspend all my other opinions and I turn my attention inward, what do I know for sure? Well, the I that thinks is like my thinking is the sort of thing that can't be doubted. So again, we get like thinking is one of the first, very simple, most well-known ideas that I have. He goes to great lengths to say that there are no unconscious perceptions. And perhaps this is not surprising by now. This is Locke's style, right? No unconscious ideas, no unconscious perceptions. You believe in that? No unconscious perceptions? If it was unconscious, did you perceive it? So yeah, this is maybe, did the mind perceive it? And like, yeah, you could say like coming from the Freud school, yeah, Freud's got like a pretty rigorous sense of like the unconscious. I don't know how reliable Freud is on this point. I know that he tells me that I want to sleep with my mother, and I don't really believe that, but like, yeah, but like, yeah, who can blame him there? It's crazy addictive. Everybody loves cocaine. That's kind of the point. This is why I don't try cocaine. If you're like, my life's just fine, like, well, should I add cocaine? Like, no, leave it the way it is. It'll be just fine without cocaine. Never seen anybody be like, oh yeah, cocaine, yeah, all right, I tried it once. That was good. I had that experience. No. All right. We're a little bit sidetracked now. Perception, thinking, that's passive. Volition, the will, that's active. The passive one, very easily known. No such thing as an unconscious perception. And you might be thinking to yourself, like, but what about? Like, there does seem to be some sort of, like, unconscious thing. Or, like, my eyes are open, and I'm not attending to all the things, but, like, things are coming into my eyeball and impinging on my retina, and maybe even creating some sort of neurological event in my brain, even if I'm not attending to it. Are those perceptions, though? Maybe this is one of the places where Locke does get kind of persnickety about what words mean and how he's going to use them. He'll say, like, that's the body, perhaps. Like, the body is doing stuff. If you want to, like, what's Locke's account of, like, the unconscious? He'll be like, oh, yeah, that's easy. It's the body. Unconsciously, I find myself, like, just grabbing the cigarette and, like, putting it in my mouth and lighting it. I never thought to, like, make that decision. That was completely unconscious. And Locke would say, like, yeah, it wasn't, your mind didn't do that. Your body did that. It was just bodily habit, nothing else. No such thing as an unconscious perception, because if it was unconscious, it ain't a perception. It's just something else. If the light goes like through the lens, like through the lens and then through the iris and then to the back of my retina, and it like creates a chain reaction down my optic nerve, and then before it gets to the visual cortex of my brain, the signal just gets interrupted. Did any sight happen? If it never comes to my mind, it ain't sight. If I put my hand on a hot stove and all of like the pain receptors start firing up my arm, but like somewhere around my shoulder where like I had that kind of shrapnel from the grenade, it like completely severed my nerve, and it just never really makes it past here to my brain. Was there heat? Was there a sensation of heat? If it doesn't make it to the mind, it's not sensation. It's not a perception. Yes?
Wouldn't there still be a lasting visual mark in your hand from the heat if you didn't feel it or have a reaction in the brain?
Then you would you would perceive it through sight. You would not perceive it through touch. And if we're talking about the simple ideas that come from one sense alone, like warmth and cold, you would not perceive it at all, right? There would be no warmth or cold. There would be the sight of like the charred and blistering skin on your hand. But that sight wouldn't feel hot to you. Does that seem about right?
Could it still look hot?
It would look as if it might feel hot. But things don't look hot. I mean, it might, like, some people might look hot. But that's, now we're just using words in, like, radically different sorts of ways. Yeah, Jua.
What about cases with amputee fishes who, like,
Yeah, phantom limb syndrome sort of stuff. Like, I have no arm, but I feel pain in my non-existent arm. Is there pain? Yep. Just like there's no such thing as an unconscious perception, there's no such thing as a false perception, I suppose. Like, unless you start saying, like, I think that my hand is, like, present, attached to my body, and some distress is happening to the tissues in my arm, or something like that. If you think that, then we'd be like, oh, maybe you've gone too far. But if you say, like, I feel pain in my non-existent arm, and if somebody was just like, no, you don't, you'd be like, bullshit, I totally do. I feel it. Like, that perception is happening. Yes, Corinne.
When Margaret Cavendish was talking about how there's enough matter in your entire body,
Yeah.
where does this fall into that? Because wouldn't you be able to feel it whether or not it's being released to your brain with what she was saying to you?
I don't know how to answer that question. I do know that John Locke seems to not be quite as given to those kinds of panpsychist tendencies that Margaret Cavendish has. So my sense is if you said to John Locke, yeah, but John Locke, what about all the sensitive matter in your body? John Locke would be like, what? What are you talking about, sensitive matter? Like, minds are sensitive. Minds are capable of sensory perception. But, like, the matter all by itself, no, maybe not. Does it disprove? No, it just assumes that she's wrong, which doesn't prove anything. It just starts from a different place. Yeah, we're not really going to see anybody else who's playing with this idea of sensitive matter like Margaret Cavendish was. Good question as well. All right, perception. That's all. We've been talking about perception for a little while here, right? Are plants capable of perception? John Locke runs through like a whole list of like, well, maybe this is capable of perception. Margaret Cavendish said rocks are capable of perception. Maybe this will get, okay, yeah. It was like the next thing that I wanted to talk about. I've got a great answer to your question. John Locke says, are rocks capable of perception? Margaret Cavendish would be like, well, kind of, in a way, maybe, yeah. John Locke says, no, rocks are not capable of perception. Tennis ball is not capable of perception. Billiard ball is not capable of perception. This marker, not capable of perception. What about a plant? Is a tree capable of perception?
Not in the traditional human sense.
In any sense?
Well, they'll grow towards the sunlight.
So they behave in certain ways, right? They behave in certain ways that seem to like respond to stimuli. So yeah, like a plant will turn its leaves towards the sun and it'll grow its roots down in search of water and stuff like that. If you flip a plant over, it'll right itself slowly, but eventually it'll do it.
What about like the Venus flytrap?
What about the Venus flytrap?
How it closes.
Yeah,
When something lands, then it closes.
then it closes. All plants do a similar sort of thing. If you put your like finger up against like a pea plant tendril, it'll
Is that not a sense?
grab on and then kind of pull itself. It'll do it real slow. Venus flytraps are faster than other plants, but I don't know if they're like completely. They eat animals. That's kind of an interesting thing for a plant. But aside from that, I don't know if they get to be animals just because they move a little faster than some plants do. John Locke gives an interesting example where he's kind of saying, like, I don't think that plants really count. And he says, if you take a rope, I don't know if you've had this experience, if you take a rope and you pour water on it, like a small length of rope, like as we've all done, right? And you get a rope and you pour some water on it. I'd never heard about this before until I read Locke, and then I was like, is that a thing? And I started asking some like sailors and people who work with ropes, and they're like, yeah, that actually does happen. If you pour water on a length of rope, it will contract. It'll shorten. Is that right? Or will it expand? Either way, it'll behave. Did it perceive the water? Locke says similar things going on with plants. He's like, I won't give him perception. He ends up drawing, he says animals, perception. I think so. Animals have perceptions. Most animals. Humans, totally. You guys remember where he draws the line? He like picks one particular organism and he goes, this seems like maybe where the boundary is. The oyster. He says, oysters. Do you remember this? You're like, what's John Locke talking about oysters for? And you might be saying, I don't remember that because I didn't read the parts that weren't on the quiz. John Locke talks about oysters in order to suggest that, like, I think oysters maybe are capable of perception. And it seems like one of the things, he's kind of drawing on some very Aristotelian ideas here. It's not the first or the last time that he's going to do that in the essay, where he's kind of suggesting that, like, look, animals seem to, or all of those creatures that are capable of kind of locomoting around the surface of the earth, that can like get up and move from one place to another, something needs to kind of determine why they move, when they move. They're not just like spazzing out all the time. Like a fox in the woods isn't just like freaking out and just like moving all willy-nilly. It moves in very kind of predictable and purposive ways. And in order to do that, it needs to be able to perceive its environment and know that like those things are good. Those things are painful. Those things are pleasant. Plants don't do that so much. They behave, but a plant never kind of looks around and says, and this is not true, there's at least one plant that does this, and it freaks me out. But other plants don't say, there's not enough water here. This is much better. And like put themselves down. There is one plant that does do that. And it's freaky. That plant's an animal.
Yeah, now we gotta know, man.
I don't remember its name. But, you know, if there are people who had, like, internets on them, I think it's an African plant, if I'm not mistaken. But it's probably Australian. All the weird shit's from Australia. All right. Perception. We've been talking about that for a little while. Volition is active. The will, particularly free will, I'll get to that in just a second. That'll pop up again when we start talking about power. We've already mentioned power once. We're going to mention power again when we start talking about complex ideas. Are we ready to start talking about complex ideas? Can we talk about it? I'm dying to talk about complex ideas. Let's talk about complex ideas. The first thing John Locke does in the discussion of complex ideas is, surprise, he makes some categories and distinctions. And he says, there are 3 activities that are responsible for the creation of complex ideas. The simple ideas are the ones that are simple, right? They have no parts. They weren't assembled from other things. They just come directly to me, either from sensation or reflection. Sometimes both. Sometimes just one sense. Sometimes multiple senses. But all the simple ideas are just kind of like, boom, they come right like a color. Like that's it. There are 3 activities that are responsible for the creation of complex ideas. And those activities are as follows. There is an activity of relating things. Relating one simple idea to another simple idea can make a complex idea. There's the activity of combining multiple ideas into a unity. And then last but not least, there's the activity of abstracting. Abstracting or separating one piece of an idea, of a simple idea? How's that work? Abstracting, separating. I could see if I start out with a complex idea, I might be able to abstract or separate pieces of it apart. Could I do this on a simple idea? Could I abstract something from it? Seems like it would be difficult. We ran into a little bit of trouble like this with Descartes, where Descartes said that the mind-body unity is a simple idea. And we were like, the unity of 2 things is a simple idea? And Descartes says, yeah, well, I said it was a unity. And you're like, yeah, but it's a unity of 2 things. How simple is that? Well, if you take it as one thing, then it's a simple idea. And Locke's actually doing a similar sort of thing. There's a whole lot of ambiguity between the conversation about simple ideas and complex ideas. This is like one of the kind of like the big turns that I had this last time that I read Locke's essay. I used to get confused in the way that he would talk about space back here as like a simple idea for multiple senses, and then later on he's going to talk about the complex idea of space. And I'm like, hold on. You said it was simple. And he's like, yeah, it is simple, but it's also complex. And power, is a simple idea that you can get from reflection or sensation. It's also a complex idea that we'll talk about. What? How could it be both? And the way that it can be both is Locke seems to be working under this idea that like it depends on how you take it. This might come back to this idea. We use the same word for both, but sometimes we're thinking about it in a complex way. Sometimes we're thinking about it in a simple way. Sometimes we're actually thinking about these ideas in confused ways too, where we're not exactly sure what it is that we're thinking, but there's like some complexity to the idea. Sometimes it's like unified and simple and it comes to us all at once, and sometimes we can kind of break it up. It might come to you as one idea, one simple idea, but you can still, like once you turn your attention to it, once you start reflecting on it, you might be able to break it into other parts. So we have these 3 activities: relating, combining into unity, and abstracting or separating. And then on top of those 3 activities that are responsible for the creation of complex ideas, we get 3 kinds of complex ideas. And those 3 kinds of complex ideas are relations, substances, and modes. And we could write books just about those 3 different kinds of complex ideas. Or what's probably more likely going to happen is we can talk about it for a little under 15 minutes, which is what remains of the class. But I'll point this out, at least, before we kind of get going on talking about, like, what are these 3 different kinds of ideas and what's going on with the 3 activities that are responsible for creating complex ideas. Do you notice a pattern right off the bat, or at least, like, hints of a pattern, a vague whiff of a pattern? Is there a connection between the way that these complex ideas are created, the activities that go into creating them, and the kinds of complex ideas that there are? Yes, Pearson.
I mean, you could maybe describe this combination of properties
Yeah, substances look like maybe there's a kind of a combination into a unity when we're talking about substance. Modes seem like maybe they have to do, and these two are maybe less obvious because we don't know, those of us who weren't very careful readers, or it's been a little while since you've read, maybe we don't remember what exactly substances and modes are. We'll definitely talk about that in the remaining time. But relations are probably made by relating things. Yeah. Like that clue alone should suggest that, oh, great, all right, so like this activity is responsible for creating relations, and maybe, oh yeah, this one seems to fit there, and this one seems to fit there, and then I'm going to put a big fat question mark and multiple question marks all over this, because I don't actually think it works that way. That's very, very tempting. But you'll notice that Locke never says, like, there are three ways of like creating complex ideas, and those three ways correspond to three different kinds. He doesn't spell it out quite like that. He leaves it a little bit vague. And the more you start attending to substances and modes and relations, the more you start realizing that, like, oh, it is not that simple as relations are made by relating, substances are made by unifying, and modes are made by abstracting. But it's a good start. It's a good start to understanding what these things mean. When he starts talking about modes, and these are maybe, like, modes are perhaps one of the most interesting kinds of complex ideas that Locke is talking about, mostly because modes are made by taking one piece away from another idea. And it's always in such a way such that that thing that you've abstracted, this is why we suggest that modes are created through abstraction or separation, the thing that is abstracted can't actually subsist all on its own. So for example, tallness. Is tallness a thing that can exist all by itself? Or do there have to be tall things? Yeah, maybe you'd have to have short things. And so maybe taller. Taller definitely seems like that's a relation, right? But tallness? Or maybe redness? Does redness exist all by itself? What about 3? What about the number 3? Is the number 3 a thing all by itself? And all the like latent Platonists in the room are like, yeah, totally. They're like stapled to the sky somewhere. The form of 3 is just like hanging out with the gods, and when I die, I'll go be with it. In the meantime, I just have like a vague memory that I'll recollect, a kind of unconscious idea that's waiting dormant in my soul. And John Locke's like, yeah, no. That's not how this works. There are 3 things. There we go. 3 things. All right. Where's 3 in this? And it seems that 3 is something that I abstract away from 3 things. And it doesn't really stand all by itself. And there are many modes that work this way. These are complex ideas. This is tricky because I've taken one piece out of something that seemed like it had maybe many pieces. I took one thing away from another idea, and now this thing that I took away is complex. It's complex because of the way that it reveals the original idea to have had parts, right? It's also complex in the sense that it was made. It doesn't come to me. It's an idea that I make on the basis of those ideas that did come to me through sensation or through reflection, through perception, right? If these are activities that the mind is engaging in, this is maybe another like potential exam question. Locke doesn't really quite spell this out, but we might wonder like what faculty of the mind is responsible for the creation of these complex ideas. And insofar as it is an activity, it seems like it would have to be some sort of like part of the will. But Locke doesn't really go into too many details on that. Yeah, Pearson.
So I have going back to the simple ideas from one sense alone. So in one sense alone, I can see there are 3 different.
Yes.
And so I can abstract from that 3.
And so you can get 3, right? Yeah. When you abstract 3 away from the 3 objects, now you've got something that's clearly a mode because it can't stand on its own. Yeah.
That's how abstraction of simple ideas.
Mm-hmm. And you come up with all kinds of ideas like this.
It sounds like the word simple is then being defined by how many senses you use, not by the content of the idea itself, though. Because he's just saying it's simple because through one sense, but he hasn't really discussed the content of the idea. Because that's 3 different.
It's simple in the way that it comes to you in like one unity.
Yeah, so he's not actually discussing the content of the idea. It's just how you get the idea.
this is, and this could be, just to be clear, I think Locke is of the opinion that this can be both. This can be both one thing and three things. I know that might sound confusing, but like it's one thing as a collection of three things. It is a collection of three things.
I just think that 1x would be content speaking symbolism.
Yeah.
He doesn't account for that.
Okay. So 1, unity, perhaps? What about beauty? Is there like beauty itself hanging out someplace in the world? Are there beautiful things?
Almost sounds like simple ideas and complex ideas aren't necessarily contradictory.
Well,
Simple ideas can be used on complex ideas, such as the fact that you can perceive something as being beautiful with your sight alone.
do you get beauty directly from sight? Or do you get like color and shape located in space? And then from that, maybe you also will turn your eye inward and recognize that and I experienced both inward and outward, I experienced some pleasure in this sight, in this particular arrangement of color and shape arranged in space. And then not only did I see a picture that gave me pleasure, but I also heard a melody that gave me pleasure. And then I thought about justice, and that gave me pleasure. And I said, what is it that all of these things that give me pleasure have in common? And I might say to myself, well, they're all beautiful. Do we see how I'm abstracting something from all of those? This seems to be the way that Locke is talking about modes. He also says there are two different kinds of modes. There are simple modes, and there are, you would be forgiven if you're and complex modes, but no, there's simple modes and mixed modes. And simple modes are still complex ideas because they're modes, and modes are a kind of complex idea. But simple modes are modes that are abstracted from just one kind of thing. A dozen is the example that he gives for this. There's no such thing as just dozen. There's a dozen eggs. There's a dozen apostles. And it's always the same thing, right? A dozen people in the front row. They're person, 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 person. Dozen eggs. Egg, 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 egg. Beauty is a mixed mode because you don't just get beauty from one thing. Beauty is the sort of thing that kind of comes from many different sources. It's a potentially mixed mode. Substances, on the other hand, if modes are these things that can't stand on their own, substance is all about being able to stand on your own. There's so much baggage that comes with this term substance, and not nearly enough time to begin to get into it. And this is one potential focal point for a class on the epistemology and metaphysics of the early modern era. We could just spend almost the entirety of the time talking about substance. There have been versions of this class in the past that have done exactly that. I'm kind of skating over it, but it's unavoidable here. Substance is, for lack of a better sort of a phrasing, and maybe this is good enough to get us started, substance is the thingliness of things. Substance is that by virtue of which a thing is an independently existing thing. Yeah. You might be thinking to yourself, when is... One of the paradigmatic examples of a substance is a human being. A human, an individual human being is something that exists on its own terms. It doesn't require something else to exist in order for it to exist. It might die if there's no food around, but your existence isn't dependent on other things. The same way that the dozen's existence depends on the dozen eggs in order to be a dozen. Does that make sense? We can also look to kind of etymology here and see substance or it literally means standing under, or subtending, or kind of sometimes folks will say subject in some very specific sort of almost grammatical or logical contexts to talk about a similar sort of thing, which literally means to throw under, something that's thrown underneath. And the thing that's going on with substances in almost like every instance that Locke is talking about these is that substances seem to be this way that we unify. So this marker, you see the red part? You see the white part? You see the red part? You see the white part? You hear that? Do all those belong to the same thing? The red part, the white part, and over here, and the sound, and this time, and this time, and this time. It's always the same thing. Those sensations that you get from it, they all belong to something. They're all kind of unified in one thing. And Locke says, that's substance. That's the idea of substance. It's a complex idea, and it's this idea that seems to fundamentally come from combining into a unity all of the other qualities, or perhaps we might use the term accidents. Locke doesn't use that. But all of the properties that inhere in a substance, they've got to like glom on to something in order for it to be one thing. And that's one of the things that substance does. Paradigmatic example of a substance, like I said, human being. Big question that Locke asks and gives all kinds of like fascinating answers all about. What makes you one human being? Your cells? They change throughout time. Your mental substance, your soul, as Descartes would refer to it. Yeah, he ends up going with memory. He says your memory is what allows you to kind of like draw all of these past versions of yourself into one thing and say, like, there's the thinker of all of my thoughts. And I'm kind of coming up with this complex idea that says, like, I had this idea, and then I had the bowling party when I was 5 years old, and then I kissed a girl, and then, like, I ate a turkey sandwich, and then I became a vegetarian. And, like, all of these things happen to the same person, by virtue of which, like, I can string them all together with memory. If my memory fails, there's, like, a huge disruption in my memory, such that I lose all my memories. Locke says, yeah, for all intents and purposes, you're a completely different person now. Interesting sort of claim. Relations he gets into, like the paradigmatic example that he goes to here, is cause and effect. Personal identity is the big one for substance. Power is the big one for like modes. He discusses like power, and especially the example for power that he uses is freedom of the will. The power to direct your will in whatever way you would like. That's actually not the freedom of the will that Locke talks about. We're out of time, but I really want to talk about those three things. But it doesn't seem justifiable to do a whole new class session on that. I might post another little video that talks about personal identity, power, especially free will, and cause and effect. Those are all three of them huge ideas. Once you start examining them, this system that looks all tidy right now starts to get really messy and mushy and fall apart. And David Hume's going to exploit that in a big, big, big way. All three of those things, personal identity over time, cause and effect, and free will, are like all things that David Hume is going to say, like, yeah, they're messy with Locke, and for good reason. I will see you guys on Thursday.